We're going to start with a sort of general introduction to relationships now, and understanding how your relationship style evolves, as well as how it can interact with mental health or mental illness. Now, the basic perspective that we use to understand relationships in psychology is called the attachment perspective. According to this, like as babies, we have what we call proximity-seeking behaviors with our parents, and we move towards them for help or sustenance. The way they respond to this can impact our ideas of how we see ourselves and how we see other people. Okay? For instance, if the parent is able to respond in an emotionally attuned and appropriate manner to the needs of the child feels that yes, the world is a good place which will meet my needs, and they also feel that they are worthy of love and affection. Okay? They feel safe, and this safety enables them to explore the world in a more comfortable way. So this is what we call secure attachment. Okay? If on the other hand, parents are more harsh or rejecting or not able to respond to the child's needs at all, then the child will start to see the world as other people are like cruel, they're not really worth it, they're not going to meet my needs. And they also can have doubts about themselves, like, you know, am I really worth it, because no one seems to want to respond to me. And these are people who end up sort of dismissing relationships altogether and saying that relationships are not really worth it, they can't really, there's no point investing too much in them. And this is what we call dismissive or avoidant attachment. Okay? The third type is one where the parents are kind of inconsistent. There may be times when they are very loving, caring, responsive, and there may be other times where they're quite unavailable. So here the child gets a little confused. There are times when the environment will meet my needs, and there are times where it won't, and so I have to be very careful and vigilant always looking at the relationship to make sure that it's there and it's meeting my needs. These are people who we describe as being insecurely or anxiously attached. Okay? So depending on these early experiences, either you're likely to feel secure in relationships, to feel anxious about relationships, or to be sort of dismissive and not really wanting relationships at all. Okay? Of course, earlier it was believed that what happens in childhood is pretty much what you're stuck with through your life. But now we know that every relationship experience you have can feed into your internal working model of who you are and how other people are. So subsequent relationships, sometimes with teachers, with friends from school, your first romantic partner, your spouse, these also, depending on how responsive and attuned the other person is, can change the way in which you look at yourself and the way in which you relate to others. Okay? So this is kind of how our style of relating develops in the first place. The next idea that I'm going to talk about is what we call the systemic perspective. Here, this looks at what happens when two people are interacting with each other. And it gives us some tools to sort of understand that interaction. The first important idea from here is that when we look at relationships, we don't really look at two individuals. Rather, we look at how they interact with each other. So what this means is, like, we won't be saying, for example, Sita is too emotional or John is too unemotional. We may be saying Sita is more emotional than John, or John is less emotional than Sita. And so what we need to do really is to find a way of filling that gap. Okay? The second significant idea from the systemic perspective is that in relating to each other, we can develop sort of patterns. You may find in your experience that there are some people with whom you're happy, you're lighter, you're cheerful. Or there are some people with whom you're a little more impatient, you're a little more thing. So depending on the relationship and the typical interactions that you keep on having, we kind of automatically slip into certain patterns. Okay? Now some of these patterns, particularly with couples, if they become rigid, if they become, this is the only way we relate to each other, this can become problematic. Okay? So patterns that we commonly see can include stuff like, let's say a demand withdraw pattern, where one person has a stronger need for intimacy and is constantly moving towards the other person, and the other person has a slightly weaker need for intimacy perhaps and is constantly moving away. So one is always demanding attention, time, look at me, talk to me, whereas the other is always trying to move a little back. No, I need a little space, I have something else to do. And this can perpetuate itself. We can have cycles of attack and defend, where the automatic way of talking is that I'm slightly accusatory in my tone, and then in response the other person is slightly defensive, and this sort of dance can just go on and on. Getting stuck in a dance can be a problem, and that's something which, if you notice it's happening, you should try to break. The third interesting idea or important idea is that each relationship forms a kind of subsystem. So if I'm in a relationship, say me and my husband would form one subsystem. This subsystem will interact with other subsystems. Okay, so the way I'm relating to my husband, for example, can interact with the way I relate to my child. Or the way he relates to his mother can interact with the way we relate with each other. So each subsystem will have an impact on other subsystems, and so this gets complex because we are individuals, we are acting on our relationships, on the people around us, but our relationships and our context are also acting back on us. And kind of being able to take a step back and see the whole picture can really help you to understand what's going on. Okay? The third perspective that I want to bring in when it comes to relationships is that each stage of life, the relationship that you have is kind of dependent on what's happening in the previous stage. Okay? So the relationship that you have with your child as an 8-year-old will have an influence on the relationship that you have with them as an adolescent and subsequently as an adult. The relationship you had with your parents when you were a teenager will have an impact on the relationship you have with them later. So it makes sense to sort of, address relationship issues now, because they can pile up and get more and harder to deal with the longer you put off doing something about them. We're talking a lot about relationships. What really is a good relationship? A good relationship is one where you feel that your individuality is respected, where you feel you can be yourself, where you feel comfortable, where you feel safe and supported, where you feel that I can say whatever it is that I feel like saying, and largely my choices and who I am as a person, there's acceptance and there's space for that here. And of course, it's one where you are able to give the same to the other person. It does not work if it's only happening with you. So this is a tall order, I know, but one that overall is well worth it. And why is it well worth it? Well, just from a mental health perspective, what we found is that the way you relate has a significant impact overall on your mental health. Now, good relationships are great buffers for mental health problems. If you're in a healthy, supportive, safe relationship, you're less likely to develop a disorder. If you do develop a disorder, the intensity is less, there may be fewer episodes. So it buffers you overall from the impact. The same with physical illness. A healthy relationship also buffers you from negative physical health problems. And overall, you lead a happier, healthier, longer life if you're in a good relationship. Conversely, if you're in a bad relationship, one that is conflictual, one that leaves you feeling stressed and unhappy about yourself and your life, it can have a strong negative impact on your mental health. So it can precipitate a problem, or it can make an ongoing problem worse. It can worsen your physical health, and this is not just in terms of doctors' fees and visits, but mortality itself. So overall, it makes sense for us to try and have healthy relationships. And it makes sense for us to understand ourselves and the relationships so that we can do this.